Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CRP's third session of the CLP Connect 4 event series. My name is Rachel Aldridge, Communications Project Manager at CLP. It's 4 p.m. and we have 5 speakers today from 3 different organisations, as well as a Q&A session at the end. So as always, it's an interactive event, and we'll examine the ways of mitigating the negative impact of road traffic in London through reduction, innovation and legislation methods. We'll be discussing brand new research into rail freight in collaboration with Momentum Transport, as well as hearing about construction logistics plans with Jacobs as well. So our expert panel consists of Isadora Rivera-Volmer, Project Officer at CRP, who will be presenting on CRP's Clean Air Villages for rail freight guidance. Ollie Balderson, Principal Consultant at Momentum Transport, will be providing some more finer detail on this guidance. And finally, Gordon Sutherland, Traffic and Logistics Specialist, Mark Thurkel, Project Manager and Environment Specialist, and Morag Robertson, Logistics Manager from Jacobs, will be delving into construction logistics plans and looking at how organisations can be more mindful of their environment. So please ask questions along the way throughout the chat. Please introduce yourselves over there and we'll answer these at the end of the session if you haven't already asked them through Eventbrite. But quickly before we kick off with today's presentations, I'm delighted to introduce and launch CRP's annual report and business plan. So it's now CRP's 27th year delivering positive change across London. And this document details our newest vision statement, shares testimonials and our achievements throughout the year and setting our ambitious targets for next year too. So this slide is our vision statement and a map of those areas that we work in. We're incredibly proud to be showcasing all the work we're doing to support public, private and voluntary organisations. The business plan showcases emission savings from the Clean Air Villages 4 project, reports other guidance from Central London Sub-Regional Transport Partnership, and over the past year we've also created 4 new guidance documents as part of the Healthy Streets Every Day programme, launched 12 of our events, had the pleasure of speaking at lots of different national events on the impact of our projects amongst other achievements. So these are just some of the testimonials from our partners and support for our projects. Over the next year, we want to be really ambitious and continue to work with partners who declared a climate emergency, champion greener, cleaner ways of living. We will be completing the Clean Air Thames, Healthy Streets Every Day, Clean Air Villages 4 projects, and also starting some new programmes such as Clean Air Freight and Clean Air Logistics for London. So it's been amazing to see the targets hit for our current projects, especially kind of the tangible outcomes. Like cargo bike schemes and over 200 CAPL one-to-ones, and we're really excited to kind of get going with the new programmes and from new funding sources as well. So I believe Dave's posted a link and you can kind of take a full look on our website for everything in a lot more detail than I've put through. Okay, perfect. I'd now like to pass over to my colleague Isadora Rivera-Volmer to talk a bit more about Clean Air Villages 4 and our research into rail freight. So over to you, Isadora.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everybody. My name is Isadora and I'm a project officer at CRP. I will now provide a quick summary of CRP's CAF4 program, as well as a bit of context regarding our rail freight feasibility study that we've commissioned Momentum Transport to undertake. Ollie, our next speaker from Momentum Transport, however, will talk more about this study in more detail. First of all, for context, CRP's Clean Air Villages 4, or CAF4, is a DEFRA-funded project led by Westminster City Council in collaboration with 26 project partners to improve air quality across different London villages, where air pollution and population density levels are high. CAF4 builds on the successes of the award-winning CAF1, CAF2 and CAF3 programs, which all focused on interventions to support businesses, communities and hospitals. CAF4 aims to deliver ambitious freight solutions for a clean air business recovery from COVID-19. And these freight solutions incorporate consolidation, distribution, mode, technology and policy elements, which are trialled across the different clean air villages. So this rail freight feasibility study has been in progress for around 4 months. CRP first shared the study's brief with 11 potential consultants in November. And the following month, we then reviewed all proposals we received, and after careful evaluation, we commissioned Momentum Transport to undertake this rail freight feasibility study. CLP Momentum Transport then had the first inception and kickoff meeting in December, after which Momentum Transport then begun the research. Stage 1 of this research was recently completed this month, and we plan to publish the finalized study this spring. So there are many reasons why we commissioned this study. First of all, an expanded rail freight network and a greater variety of products being moved by rail could be a promising solution for improving London's air quality and reducing congestion by decreasing the time polluting freight vehicles spend on roads. It will also enable sustainable last mile delivery services for providers, as goods could be delivered by, for example, zero emission vehicles and cargo bikes from central railway stations. CRP's CAF4 project identified that there are potential stakeholders in various business sectors in London that are currently struggling to incorporate rail freight into their logistics and are looking for viable solutions and guidance. This feasibility study aims to identify opportunities for rail freight in the context of sustainable last mile solutions, helping to enable organizations and businesses to utilize rail as part of their supply chains and logistics. The study will include helpful learnings and recommendations on how to potentially solve some of the identified challenges surrounding rail freight into London. This report aims to target mainly retailers, businesses and organizations, logistics providers, freight and rail operators, the wider rail industry, and also facilitators such as bids, local authorities and landowners. The study will, for example, include research on past trials and current freight and rail models, key findings of stakeholder engagement, a summary of barriers and key challenges, and a summary of identified opportunities, as well as helpful recommendations and viable solutions. However, our next speaker, Ollie, will go into more detail in a bit. In terms of next steps, Momentum Transport Consultancy is currently carrying out the study, which will be published in spring, and the study will be shared with CAF4 project partners and also posted on our website. We at CLP will continue to expand our knowledge on freight and reducing air pollution in London as part of our next upcoming projects. For example, the DEFRA-funded Clean Air Logistics for London project, or CALL project, will move more freight into London via river rather than road, supported by a network of highly visible zero-emission delivery methods across the central London area. This includes electric vehicles, cargo bikes, and walking freight. This project will begin in July 2022, just after CAF4 is finished, and will last until June 2023. It will be delivered by CRP along with 10 project partners. We will also continue to work on rail-related opportunities as part of our urban health funded project, Clean Air Freight. And this project will run from May 2022 until June 2023. And there are two main elements to the project. These are preparing for more rail freight deliveries into London and trialing zero-emission last-mile logistics from a centre in South London. These two elements will be delivered simultaneously and will reinforce one another beneficially. That's all from me. Thanks, everybody. I'm now pleased to pass over to Ollie from Momentum Transport, who will tell you a bit more about this study.
Hi, thank you very much, Isadora. I'm Ollie Balderson. I'm a principal consultant at Momentum Transport Consultancy, who are a London-based specialist transport consultancy working in development planning, master planning stadiums, logistics, construction, and also research work. Isadora's set up the study really nicely already, so thank you. We're working on the premise that rail freight can address some of the issues associated with road freight vehicles. It doesn't necessarily eliminate all of them or naturally get rid of them, but it certainly can be really valuable and supportive. So we're undertaking a feasibility study, as Isadora laid out, and we're looking to understand case studies, really get into some interviews, and consider different types of demand and types of goods that could be used for rail freight. The key parameters of this this work is that we wanted to, so on the right hand side we've got a map of all of the rail operations of the southeast of England, so it's quite a large scale. We wanted to limit that and narrow it down slightly, so we're looking at terminus stations, which naturally gives us a more central focus. It's not by any stretch of the imagination the only place where we can study this, but we think that operationally, from a rail operation perspective, that's a really good place for us to start. We also want to match up the type of demand for different goods and goods that can be consolidated more easily. We know that certain types of goods and certain types of demand don't work that well for consolidated freight, and that could be because of business need and urgency of goods, but it could also be because goods come from various small suppliers and they all have their own micro operations. And we're looking to learn from a really wide range, and that's in the way that we've gathered our interview data, but also looking for inspiration from cargo planes, for example, construction operations, and also waste operations in the city. We've looked at a wide range of case studies. These are free, 2 in the UK and one in France, which are using passenger trains, which have been in some way retrofitted to be used for carrying freight. It shows that they can be done. Not all of them have been successful, but a lot of them have had good longevity of operation, and so it really gives us confidence for the future. We undertook a really wide range of surveys, and we're really grateful to everyone that took part in our interview process. We took loads of really great information, but some of the key takeaways I've listed here, and we'll go through. I'll go through the clockwise way. That one of the main things was that passenger trains were seen as the future of rail freight, and that's in some way an adapted passenger train, where we have freight either using an entire passenger train with no passengers in, or using a single or a couple of carriages at the front or back of a train where there are no passengers in those carriages. And our respondents found that the impact of COVID on passenger numbers and demand has really opened up that opportunity. At the same time, we understand that freight trains are very limited in supply, and their train paths are also really limited too. We're really thoughtful about the impact on public realm that introducing another use to a station could have. That came through quite strongly in our interviews too, and I think that's really timely with the release of another CRP report today on river freight and how that's introduced in the public realm. So it's something to be really mindful of all the way through this. The main motivation for road freight is costs, and we think that a key push factor is road user charging. So there's a load of cost associated with using road-based freight, but it's a very established supply chain and model. Road user charging in London especially is something that's being talked about quite seriously and could be introduced before the end of Sadiq Khan's mayoral term. So that could really change the equation for freight operators and really push freight operators to want to use rail on a much wider scale. The appetite is absolutely there, and that's consistent across the board of freight operators. That's consistent for Network Rail, for TfL, who play a facilitating role, and there's also appetite on the demand basis for companies that are looking more closely at their supply chain to ensure that they're sustainable as much as possible. Notwithstanding that, there's a major commercial challenge. We understand that a lot of freight operators work to very low margins on their freight operation, and that limits their ability or appetite to spend a lot upfront to trial these operations. One of the things we've been undertaking is looking at different stations, and we've picked 5 stations in central London. Most of these are terminal stations, but Old Oak Common is not. And we've then tried to overlay and compare goods and different land uses and the density around those stations. So we understand that certain types of goods are much better at being consolidated than other types of goods. Some of those goods work much better for different land uses. For example, a restaurant may have goods coming from fishmongers and butchers and grocers all at different times, and it's really, really hard to manage and consolidate that operation. Whereas an office could receive much bulkier goods on a more managed basis, and so that would lend itself much better to a consolidated operation. And so what we've done is matched a level of potential alongside different land uses and looked at the density of those uses around major stations. Firstly, Liverpool Street, we think really, really high potential. The outside line is a 15-minute walking catchment. So that would be a very short e-bike or cargo bike journey where we've got a very wide range of commercial uses. Euston Station, slightly less dense, but we start tapping into the north into very large residential areas where potential higher margin goods could be delivered, and some freight operators would work very well to that model. Old Oak Commons being mapped on the existing land uses there, so that currently looks like it's got quite low potential, but certainly one for the future as development comes forward. London Victoria, again, like Euston, taps into at the outer edge of this catchment, very large residential catchment area, which we again really, really high potential, we think, as well as major commercial uses very, very close to the station. And finally, London Waterloo's got a really wide range of uses, but at we think slightly lower density, and partly that's because a lot of the catchment is made up of the River Thames, which has no land uses. We've picked some interim findings and recommendations, and these are our design recommendations. Some of them go into the minutiae of rolling cages and making sure that the roller cages are of a suitable height to get underneath and inside train doors, and not all of them are. So that's a small change that operators can make. And there's also the ramping issue from platform onto train. So that's something that just needs thinking about all the way through. There's also the top left image shows roller cages sat in the kind of standing area in the middle of a train carriage, but with the potential to include bags which have been built onto a train seat. That's something that the cargo plane industry currently uses, and we think is a really, really nice idea and could be rolled out really kind of effectively in the rail freight world. An operation that we think would take longer to design, agree, and deliver, but could have really good potential for improving capacity in certain carriages would be to put the seating on rails, and when you're decommissioning a carriage so that passengers don't use it, you could shove all of the seating into one end and create a much larger space to have more roller cages. So that would just improve the capacity of that operation. And finally, we're looking at policy and operational recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, road user charging, it's not a policy relating directly to rail, but we think it could be the most significant policy coming forward to affect rail freight. And that's just because it makes operating really, really expensive for freight operators, and they'll be much more keen to look elsewhere. We also think we're seeing a lot of station master plans coming forward. Network Rail is really, really looking at its assets really carefully, and we really like to see operational space being retained within stations, but notwithstanding the interface between pedestrians and cargo bikes or any vehicles. We appreciate that's a really, really tight space. Pedestrian demand is really high, and we need to ensure pedestrian safety through rail stations. So that's a careful piece of design that needs to take place to ensure access to the highway is secured from platforms without negatively impacting on passenger safety. In terms of types of goods, we think that high value goods and non-perishable goods are the first that could be used for rail freight. We also think that goods that are non-business critical are much better to be used by rail freight. Whilst rail is really, really normally efficient and on time, when it goes wrong, goods can be sat for a very long time without any alternative to use a different route. Whereas when you're in a traffic jam in a van, you can take a different route and still get to your final destination. So non-business critical is the first place to start, we think. We see container adaptation is really important, and I spoke about that in the previous slide. And finally, we'd like to see more of a forum between the rail industry and the freight industry. They're two large industries that really, I think, could do with improved communication so we can understand each other's operation. And that's especially important, we think, as Great British Railways comes into operation in the next couple of years. And there's a really good opportunity to look really closely at freight there. That's me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Isidora and Ollie, for your presentation. It's great to get some more detail on the study and how it fits with those wider issues of congestion and freight. Okay, I'd now like to hand straight over to Jacob, so Mark, Morag and Gordon, to present on construction logistics plans. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Rachel, and great to be here. And yeah, so I'm based in the logistics team at Jacobs along with Morag and Gordon. So we're going to be doing a three-way split in terms of the presentation. So I'll go to our slide. So just really a bit about ourselves within Jacobs. So for those who don't know Jacobs, we're got a breadth of experience, sector experience in a number of areas, including nuclear, rail, retail, military and road transport, and also with big infrastructure projects as well. We've also got a very good and core strength around construction logistics, as well as what we call an integrated logistics approach, which is very much looking at the sort of end-to-end strategic approach to logistics as well. We've got very much up-to-date thinking borne out by involvement in professional bodies such as the Chartered Institute for Logistics and Transport, and also wide client experience, including with the private sector, central government and strategic transport bodies. We provide advice on management and movement of goods and services and offer solutions which are innovative and really thought-provoking to really change how people think. So just starting off, a bit of a rhetorical question here. If this is the answer, 35%, what's the question? So how much of London's HGV traffic is related to construction? It is actually 35%. So just a bit of a core stat to sort of get the session going and perhaps the thought processes going as well. Just a bit of an overview to construction logistics plans, CLPs for short. A construction logistics plan is a key tool for planners, clients, developers, construction contractors and their supply chain, and really focuses very much on how supply chains can reduce their impact on the road network, and also impacts in terms of the environment can be minimised. And it's really looking at early stages, how you can make interventions prior to contractors being appointed, so at sort of pre-tendering stage, to really build in some mitigating measures, for example, around retiming of vehicles outside of peak congestion periods, and also exploring feasible river and rail options to move goods and materials and waste by alternative modes. So really, why construction logistics plans? Well, it's got key buy-in from the mayor in terms of the mayor's transport strategy, which promotes the use of CLPs. And for all planning applications that meet the criteria for referral to the mayor, comprehensive transport assessments, travel plans and CLPs will need to be submitted in accordance with TfL's best practice guidance. And London's local authorities have, as a part of their own remit, their own guidance policies about the use of CLPs and what they need to do in terms of meeting the local parameters and the situation on the ground. I'd like to now hand over to Morag, who's going to talk more about the environmental benefits of CLPs.
Great, thanks, Mark. And I think that Mark's already sort of indicated that there's some sort of intuitive benefits to a CLP around sort of like congestion reduction and the consequential environmental benefits in terms of CO2, in terms of air quality. and also some of the sort of like noise benefits, and I think that's something that's often not talked about. And I think one of the things that we wanted to explore when we suggested coming along to present here was to try and understand, you know, we talk about CLPs, and certainly as Mark suggested, there's a lot of backing from a political level around the use of CLPs in London in particular, is what benefits have CLPs actually driven in terms of environmental benefits or others. And I think when we've started to explore this, I think that it's quite interesting that we've struggled to find some real concrete examples. That's until Gordon's going to explore some of his stats. But one of the things that we found was an example down in Croydon with the Bernard Weatherhill house, and I think that it's quite interesting that we struggled to find really good examples, which is one of our conclusions, I think, at the end, without wishing to steal Mark's thunder. But their CLP was produced, and they're claiming that they reduced their collection and delivery vehicles by 26%. Which obviously has quite clear improvements in their reduction in contribution to congestion for their area. And as a consequence of that, they suggest that they've managed to make a saving of 53 tonnes of CO2 and the associated particulate matter and the like. So they've seen a very real benefit from an environmental perspective. I think one of the other things that's also not often talked about in the context of CLPs is the feature of looking at waste management. They managed to achieve a recycling rate of 94%, which is pretty impressive, and that's all because you're starting to focus on how you manage vehicles and movements and materials to sites and on site. I think one of the other interesting stats that's not picked up here, I know that the title of the slide is environmental benefits, but in terms of why businesses might, or construction businesses might be interested in doing a CLP, not just because it gets you through the planning process, is that in this particular example, the organisation claimed that they achieved a 97% on-time delivery performance, which is quite staggering, and considering the industry standard is about 85%. So from a efficiency perspective, there's some clear benefits. Mark, if you could go on to the next slide. And I think what we just wanted to also touch on, and Mark's already mentioned them, is, well, you know, in principle, CLPs drive all these benefits, but how do they do that? And I think some of the examples that are listed on this slide range from very practical, very logistical element, planning deliveries, organising your orders so that you're getting full capacity vehicles and all that kind of stuff. But it also goes from that through to some of the more interesting and innovative areas. So it's not just about, you know, how do you get the more product to the site and less vehicles, but it's also trying to think about doing things differently. And one example of that is on the next slide, where Crossrail have looked at the use of cargo bikes in the construction industry. And I think that initially your gut reaction might be, well, that's bonkers. How on earth are you going to use a bike to deliver construction materials? And I think what's interesting here is trying to think of different ways of doing things that just because it won't solve all of the problem, it might solve some of the problem. And I think that unfortunately with any kind of challenge around logistics and decarbonisation and congestion, there is no silver bullet, and perhaps you need to think of a suite of measures to try and reduce your impact. And I think that some of the stats that are on this slide are quite interesting, and I think the one that I've picked out from this one is the difference between the time it takes for a van to get to site versus a cargo bike. And I think that might be an attractive feature to encourage businesses to look at completely different ways of doing things. So, you know, it goes without saying that there's some risks associated with the use of cargo bikes, but notwithstanding that, I think it's an interesting innovation. And so on that note, I wanted to hand over to Gordon to talk about some of his experiences at Tideway.
Right, good afternoon, everybody. Although I'm here representing Jacobs, most of my time has been spent on the Tideway Super Sewer project in London. This is an overview of the system. It's a tunnel system to take sewage away from the Thames. So we're talking about 40 million tonnes of raw sewage a year flows into the Thames. So if we needed an excuse not to go in the Thames, that's another one. But this project will aim to stop that and make the river cleaner. So it's a 25-kilometre tunnel, and it has a 7-kilometre connection tunnel from Greenwich. So that bottom right blob is Greenwich, and that tunnel machine will end up at Chambers Wharf in Bermondsey and join the main tunnel there. So the main tunnel is from Acton in the west to Abbey Mills in the east, and where it will connect with the Lee Tunnel and be taken out to Beckton sewage treatment works to be disposed of in a nice way. That is quite interesting. We have 11 sites on the river itself, which has allowed us to move a lot of stuff by barge as opposed to road. So the tunnels themselves, they should be completed in the next couple of weeks. The Greenwich one is the last one to do that to the main tunnel, and that's coming up on the 7th of April. And the 14th of April is a TBM breakthrough date with the tunnel boring machine. And the tunnel ending up at Abbey Mills is meant to finish in a similar time. So most of the tunnelling will be done very shortly. Then it's secondary line to stop it leaking, and obviously make sure that it gets to and from its destination without spilling into the environment. So next slide, please, Mark. Tideway then, why did we do CLPs? Way back in the examination by the Planning Inspectorate, part of the Development Consent Order process, one of the main things that were extremely concerning the local residents, quite rightly, and businesses, was the potential impact on their local environment of activity associated with the work sites, not just within the work site. And it's good that the industry is looking more now at outside hoarding activity, as opposed to historically construction has been very much only caring about what happens within the hoarding. So this construction logistics approach has enabled the industry itself to think more about including its supply chain and its activities as well. So there's a two-stage development to a CLP, and that is we do the overview of it. We get that to get the planning permission in place, and there's a more detailed one that the contractors will do for us, and they do a very good job in that regard, and they get them approved by the local planning authority in consultation with the Port of London Authority to make sure that the sustainable freight hierarchy is used. In other words, river and rail first, as opposed to road and, God forbid, air, but not valid on this project, I'm happy to say. It also looks at compliance about safety as well as the environment as well. So it looks at things like FORS and clocks, so the Fleet Operator Recognition Scheme is FORS, Construction Logistics and Community Safety is clocks, and Tideway themselves are champions of both of those organisations, and their values are embedded in the CLPs. And we've got driver training as well, in addition to what, so you don't just get a licence, you have to have additional training as well in an urban environment. And we've actually got our own FORS accredited and DVSA accredited course for HGV drivers and indeed all drivers to work on the project. Okay, next please. So environmental benefits, which is the main topic of today. Well, it does force us to look at what's been talked about before, making sure that the vehicles themselves are full. There's not more vehicle movements than are absolutely necessary. Safe, low emission vehicles as much as possible. So the standards of the LEZ and the ULEZ, which effectively will be the same thing once the Mayor's proposal is undertaken in a few years' time, or the GLA area will require at least the minimum standard, or the best standard, I should say, of diesel emission vehicles or vehicles that aren't diesel. So we stipulate on Tideway that they must comply with those minimums. So they can't just pay the fine and come in. They have to either get the standard or they don't make it onto the project. So yeah, so we've got a number of KPIs embedded in the construction logistics plan with the local planning authorities and local highway authorities and Transport for London indeed as well. And we ensure that they are reported on, I'd like to say, honestly, and what good contractors that give us those statistics every month. We share them every quarter at a strategic traffic liaison group that we hold for those stakeholders. And we've got over a 99% compliance rate with all of those safety and environmental performances as well. As a footnote, I mentioned we have sites on the river. We've moved 5.2 million tonnes materials by river, and that's taken 627,000 at least HGV movements off London's roads as well. So that's quite a significant contribution, and we'd like to think we can leave a legacy of river use once we go, which will be in a couple of years' time. So next, Mark. And is that me? Is that me done, Mark?
I think that's me sort of finishing off, but just briefly sort of summarising the slides from Gordon and Morag, and I think picking up on the compliance issue, you know, I think CLPs can be seen in some contexts as, you know, you just fill out a form and it gets approved and then nothing really happens. But I think the enforcement and monitoring of CLPs is absolutely crucial, and a number of boroughs have actually taken the reins on this to have dedicated traffic management officers who actually go around sites to ensure daily compliance with key CLP measures, and where the sites aren't adhering to those requirements, a 3 or 4 step escalation process can take place involving ultimately planning enforcement taking action, or indeed traffic management removing loading bays. So that sort of stymies the actual ability of schemes to actually continue and deliver their actual works. That happens, I think, on very rare occasions, but does actually show that you can have teeth to monitoring enforcement of CLPs. I think improvement of consistency and compliance, as I've mentioned, is something that does need to be flagged here. Better promotion of the use and benefits, creating good case studies, encouraging wider uptake outside of London. Obviously, working with clocks is crucial as well. Further work on proofs and promotion of the environmental benefits of CLPs, and highlighting how more examples of CLPs can help address the key issues of congestion and provide efficiency benefits as well would be most valuable. And I think also any scope for quantifying the benefits of CLPs based on empirical data, for example, such and such a CLP has resulted in X amount of carbon reductions, has improved air quality by X amount compared to the baseline start. If we could get some of that thinking going and some of that sort of empirical evidence sort of shown and proved, I think that would also be a really important step forward as well. And that ends our presentation. Thanks, Rachel.
Rachel, I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. Classic me. Thank you so much, all our speakers. I've just taken the slides down, I was saying to myself, and if all speakers could put their cameras on, we will just do a quick Q&A session based on the presentations. So Isadora, firstly, I've had a pre-asked question. Do you have any specific stats and numbers showing some of the environmental benefits of rail freight?
Yes, so by carrying large quantities of containerized and bulk goods, rail freight already removes the need for around 7 million lorry journeys each year, and that saves around 1.4 million tonnes of CO2 emissions. TfL's London Rail Freight Strategy, which was published in May 2021, also reports that CO2 emissions per tonne of freight delivered by rail are 76% lower than by road. And lastly, also that rail freight also produces up to 10 times less small particulate matter and 15 times less nitrogen oxide than road haulage.
Brilliant, thank you. Ollie, we similarly had a question from the audience about what are the major stations in London that would be best suited for rail freight, and which rail operators are keen to transition? I think that kind of links with one in the chat about, do you still believe that terminal stations are the main solution?
Thank you. So I think terminal stations are one of a number of solutions. One thing I didn't mention in the presentation is that railway sidings were also raised as a really, really interesting opportunity. Network Rail and TfL are massive landowners. TfL owns 9% of London's land, and not all of that is required for operational uses. Both Network Rail and TfL are looking to deliver much more efficient uses of those land, and also to keep their hands in the kind of development, fingers in the development pie as developments do come forward. So there's an opportunity there to rethink uses of railway sidings. I know that outside Victoria Station, outside a number of main stations, there are sort of waiting areas where passenger trains, when they're not used in the peak hour, where all of your stock is used in the peak morning hour, they go and rest or wait just outside. There's a great opportunity to use those stations more sensibly too. Maybe it's for freight, or it's also for development opportunities. So I don't think terminus stations are the be all and end all. We think that there's an operational value to looking at them first, because it's easier to load and unload from those stations than it is on a sort of station at the middle of a train route. But yeah, not the only solution at all.
Brilliant, thank you, Ollie. For Jacobs, so do all London boroughs require contractors on large sites to provide CLPs, and if so, sorry, if not, why not? I don't know who'd like to take that one.
Well, I'll start, I guess, but I think the short answer is no, they don't. And I think the point of what we were trying to explore was to understand why that is, in the sense of trying to understand what the benefits are. And I think at the moment there aren't those quantifiable benefits, and so I think people struggle to enforce it. And I think one of the points that we're trying to promote is, well, why aren't more local authorities promoting it, both in London and outside of London, because it's not just a London orientated thing. And I think that the reason for it is being able to articulate what those benefits are and quantify them. And as we've proved in trying to do some research for this presentation, it's not as robust as it could be. And I think there's some real value in exploring that a little bit further. Yeah.
I think it's also fair to say that the profile of CLPs has been raised in London through the CLP training programme delivered by TfL, instigated by TfL. So there's more awareness across London, London boroughs and key partners, stakeholders. But and I think that has improved the uptake. But I think, you know, outside of London, I think it does get more scarce and scarce in terms of the awareness and development of CLPs with respect to big infrastructure regeneration programs. So there's more work to do in terms of spreading the message. But I know clocks, for example, do promote CLPs and also the sort of safety agenda more widely and outside London.
And I think just building on that, I think, and somebody picked up at it in the chat, was around monitoring compliance to CLPs, and that those that do require CLPs maybe don't then check and enforce, and that then means, well, what's the worth of them if they're not then followed through? And I think that becomes a resourcing issue, and I think that's another challenge that needs to be addressed.
And I think back to what I said earlier, I think if you don't have CLPs at outline stage informing the tendering process for contractors, that's a huge barrier to actually making effective, you know, difference on the ground. Because if you could actually inform the tendering process with key mitigating measures such as false silver minimum, progression to false gold, for example, this is what the contractor's got to do. If you don't sort of embed things like sort of avoiding peak periods of congestion in terms of HGV operations, embedding those sort of timings, you know, within what the contractor has to do, then the CLP is rendered a bit less effective.
Perfect. Thank you very much to all our speakers. We literally have 2 minutes left, and I'm sorry if we haven't got around to answering a question, but we will follow up with them tomorrow, definitely. I'd just like you to point you to our next session while these slides load. Well, firstly, to contact information for all our speakers on slide. These slides will be circulated after, and also our contact information. But our next session, which we can provide a link to, is taking place at the end of April. The speakers from the Illuminated River and the Port of London Authority about kind of reinventing the river with a focus on lighting, freight and monitoring. Perfect. Just with 1 minute to go, I hope you have a brilliant rest of your afternoon, and thank you so much to our speakers. And yes, hope you can join us for our next session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.